Femi was the kind of man who believed a husband's word was final. He grew up hearing his mother say, "A man is the head of the house. A woman must obey," and he never questioned it. Now, in his 30s, he was a well-known businessman in a thriving African city. He ran a successful car dealership, dressed in fine suits, and spoke with authority. People respected him. They listened when he spoke. But there was one person who refused to be controlled: his wife, Abony. Abony was nothing like the quiet, obedient wife Femi expected. She was smart, ambitious, and unafraid to speak her mind. She ran her own fabric business, designing and selling colorful African prints that customers adored. While other women in the neighborhood deferred to their husbands, Abony didn't hesitate to challenge Femi's decisions, even in public. Femi hated that. If he said, "Why are you expanding your shop? Just stay home and rest," she would smile and say, "Because I have dreams too, Femi, just like you." If he told her, "Don't talk back when I speak," she would reply, "Respect goes both ways. I won't be silenced." It was a constant battle. The last straw came one evening at a family gathering. Femi had just finished telling his friends and family about a new car business deal he was about to make. He bragged about how it was the smartest move he had ever made. Then, Abony spoke up. "But Femi, didn't you say last week that the market is unpredictable right now? Shouldn't you wait before making such a big investment?" The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at Femi. His best friend, Jide, let out a low chuckle and shook his head. "If I were you, my wife wouldn't dare challenge me like that." Femi's mother, Mama Ya, sighed loudly and whispered just enough for him to hear. "You see why I tell you to control your wife?" Femi's blood boiled. Abony had embarrassed him. Again. The argument that followed was worse than any before. As soon as they got home, Femi slammed the door behind him. "Why do you always have to question me? Do you enjoy making me look weak?" Abony folded her arms. "It's not about making you look weak. It's about making the right decisions. Why is it a crime for me to have an opinion?" Femi pointed at her, his voice dangerously low. "Because you are my wife. A wife listens. A wife obeys." Abony's expression hardened. "Then maybe you should have married a puppet." That was it. Femi couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the walls trembled. Femi drove aimlessly through the city, his mind racing. The streets were dark, the sounds of distant music and honking cars filling the night. He stopped near the market, where vendors were packing up for the evening. He sat on a bench, head in his hands, seething. "Why can't she just obey me?" he muttered under his breath. "Why can't she be like other wives?" A soft chuckle broke through the silence. Femi looked up. An old beggar sat nearby, wrapped in a tattered cloak, his dark eyes glinting under the dim streetlight. "Be careful what you wish for, young man," the beggar said in a voice that was both kind and unsettling. "Some wishes come at a terrible price." Femi scoffed. "You don't understand. A wife should respect her husband. She should listen. She should obey." The beggar smiled, slow and knowing. "Obedience without love is a dangerous thing, my son." Femi waved him off. "I don't care about riddles. I just wish my wife would obey me. That's all." The beggar's smile widened. His voice dropped to a whisper. Then, he spoke two simple words. "Wish granted." A strange chill brushed through the air, sending a shiver down Femi's spine. The beggar simply sat there, his smile never fading. Femi frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "What's that supposed to mean?" The beggar chuckled softly. "You'll see." Something about his voice sent unease creeping up Femi's neck. He shook his head, dismissing the feeling. "Old man, you talk in riddles." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, and tossed them at the beggar's feet. "Maybe find a better use for your time." The beggar didn't move, didn't even glance at the coins. He just kept smiling. Femi turned away, rolling his eyes as he walked off into the dark streets. Crazy old man. He had no idea that his nightmare had just begun. The sun peeked through the curtains, casting golden light across the bedroom. Femi stretched lazily, the argument from the night before a distant memory. He glanced at the bedside clock, 7 a.m. The familiar scent of fried plantains and spiced tea drifted from the kitchen. A satisfied smirk crossed his face. Finally, she's listening, her movements slow and mechanical as she placed food on the table. Her face was blank, her usual fiery energy gone. "Morning," Femi said, sitting down. Abony nodded but said nothing. Femi frowned. Usually, she would have made a sharp remark about him waking up late or not helping with chores. But today, nothing. He waved a hand in front of her face. "Abony, are you okay?" "Yes, Femi," she answered softly. Her voice was flat. lifeless. A strange feeling crept into his chest, but he pushed it aside. Maybe she was just tired. Testing the limits as he sipped his tea, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe this is what true obedience looks like. He decided to test it. Abony, don't talk for the next hour. She simply nodded and turned away. At first, it felt like victory. A full hour of peace, no debates, no backtalk. But then, another hour passed. Then two. Still, she didn't speak. Femi cleared his throat. Abony, you can talk now. She blinked. Yes, Femi. A chill ran down his spine. Pushing further, that evening, as Abony cleaned the living room, Femi leaned against the doorway, watching her. His mind buzzed with curiosity. How far does this go? In a moment of frustration, he muttered, just stand here until I come back. Abony froze. She didn't sit. She didn't shift her weight. She didn't even blink more than necessary. Femi chuckled at first. She's finally listening. He grabbed his keys and left to meet Jide at the bar. Hours later, the city lights twinkled as he returned home, slightly tipsy from laughter and drinks. He opened the door, expecting to see Abony cooking or reading like usual, but she was still there, standing, unmoving, in the exact same spot. Her arms hung stiff at her sides. Her lips were slightly chapped. Her eyes, once full of life, were empty, staring at nothing. Femi's stomach twisted. Abony? His voice cracked. She didn't react. He rushed to her, shaking her shoulders. Abony, I'm back. You can move now. She blinked slowly. Then, in a weak whisper, yes, Femi. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed into his arms. Femi felt the heat radiating from her skin. She was dehydrated. Her breathing was shallow. Panic gripped him. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. He had wished for obedience. But this was something else. Femi barely slept that night, her body collapsing into his arms, her lips dry and cracked. By morning, his mind raced with confusion and fear. This is just exhaustion, he told himself. She just needs rest. So, he told her, Abony, go to sleep. She obeyed instantly, lying down without a word. Femi let out a breath of relief. See, everything is fine. But when he woke up hours later, Abony was still in the exact same position. She hadn't turned. She hadn't adjusted her blanket. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. Abony, wake up. Her eyes fluttered open. Yes, Femi. No stretch. No yawn. No sign of natural sleep. Just blind obedience. A chill ran through him. The next day, Femi tried something different. Abony, eat something. She walked to the table and began eating. Spoon after spoon. Bite after bite. She never stopped. Femi's hands trembled. Okay, that's enough. She immediately put the spoon down, her lips still full, chewing mechanically. A sickening realization gripped him. She only did what he told her to. Nothing more. Nothing less. This wasn't submission. This wasn't love. This was something unnatural, and it was getting worse. That evening, Femi sat on the couch, rubbing his temples. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. Jide's words echoed in his head. If I were you, my wife wouldn't dare talk back. He had gotten what he wanted, but it felt more like a curse than a blessing. His mind screamed for space, for silence, for escape. In frustration, he muttered under his breath, just leave me alone. Abony, without hesitation, turned around and walked out the front door. Femi barely registered what had happened until he heard the door shut. His heart stopped. Abony? Silence. He rushed outside, scanning the street. She was gone. Hours passed. Then a full day. Then two. No one had seen Abony. Not at her shop. Not at the market. She had vanished. Femi's chest tightened with panic. He combed the streets, asked shopkeepers, stopped strangers, but it was as if Abony had been erased from existence. By the third day, Kojo, Abony's brother, stormed into Femi's house, his face twisted in fury. Where is my sister? His voice was sharp, dangerous. Femi stammered. I don't know. Kojo grabbed him by the collar. What did you do to her? Femi had no answer. How could he explain what had happened? That he had wished for obedience, and somehow, it had swallowed her whole. Kojo shoved him back. If anything happens to Abony, I swear, I'll never forgive you. Femi wanted to promise that she was fine, but deep down, he knew she wasn't. Days turned into weeks. Abony's fabric shop, once a lively, thriving business, began to fall apart. Customers came but left disappointed. Without Abony, orders were delayed, fabrics were misplaced, money was lost. The whispers started soon after. Mama Ya, once his biggest supporter, now looked at him with suspicion. Jide, the friend who had once laughed about controlling women, now kept his distance. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Something unnatural happened in that house, and for the first time in his life, Femi was truly, utterly alone, and terrified. Femi was no longer the proud, confident man he once was. Dark circles hung under his eyes. His clothes, once neatly pressed, were now wrinkled and unkempt. His once powerful stride had turned into a sluggish, defeated walk. He had searched every corner of the city, hospitals, police stations, abandoned buildings, but there was no sign of Abony. Every night, he lay awake, haunted by the last thing he had said to her. "Just leave me alone." And she had. The weight of regret was suffocating. For the first time in his life, Femi realized just how much he needed Abony, not as someone to control, but as someone to love. One evening, after another fruitless search, Femi wandered through the marketplace. The once vibrant streets now felt cold and unfamiliar. Then he saw him, the beggar, sitting by a flickering lantern, warming his hands over a small fire. Femi's blood ran cold. This was the man who had granted his wish. A chill crept up his spine, but he forced himself to move forward. He dropped to his knees, gripping the old man's cloak. "Where is my wife?" The beggar didn't look surprised. He simply shook his head, his voice calm, almost pitying. "You wish for obedience, but you never wish for love." Femi's throat tightened. "I don't understand." The beggar finally turned his gaze toward him, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Obedience without love is the cruelest curse of all." Femi felt his stomach drop. He had wanted a wife who never questioned him, a wife who obeyed every word, but he had never considered what that truly meant. He had stripped Abony of her will, her spirit, her very essence, and in doing so, he had lost her. Femi's voice cracked. "Is she dead?" The beggar studied him, his expression unreadable. "No." Hope flickered in Femi's chest, but then the beggar's next words sent ice through his veins. "She is trapped, somewhere beyond your reach." Femi's breath caught. "Where? How do I find her?" The beggar leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't." Femi's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" The beggar sighed. "You wish for a servant, not a wife. And so, the universe took her where servants belong." Femi's mouth went dry. "Where? Where is that?" The beggar's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "A place where she exists only to follow orders. A place where she has no thoughts, no dreams, no desires of her own." Femi's stomach churned. Abony was alive, but she wasn't Abony anymore. She was somewhere. Tears burned Femi's eyes. "Tell me how to fix this." The beggar studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke. "To break the curse, you must prove you no longer wish for control, but for love." Femi's breath came in ragged gasps. "How? Just tell me what to do." The beggar shook his head. "No command can bring her back. No demand will undo what you have done. The only way to save her is to show that you have truly changed." Femi's heart thundered in his chest, because for the first time in his life, he realized he didn't know how to love, and if he didn't learn, he would lose Abony forever. Femi sprinted home, his heart hammering in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't care. The beggar's words echoed in his mind. "To break the curse, you must prove you no longer wish for control, but for love." How could he prove something that he had never truly understood? He burst through the front door of his house, his eyes scanning the room frantically. It felt empty, hollow. Everything inside looked the same. The wooden dining table, the flower vase Abony used to refill every week, the curtains she had chosen. But without her, the house was nothing more than a shell. His hands trembled as he stepped into the bedroom. Their bed was neatly made, untouched. Abony's favorite shawl lay folded on the chair. She had always loved this house. She had filled it with warmth, with laughter, with love, and he had taken it all for granted. As Femi sank onto the edge of the bed, his eyes fell on a small wooden box tucked away on the nightstand. Something inside him stirred. He reached for it with shaking hands. Inside was a small clay figurine. Abony had made it for him years ago, sculpted with care and painted in warm earthy tones. It was of a man and a woman standing side by side, equals. He remembered the day she had given it to him. "This is us," she had said, smiling. "Together, no one above the other. Just two people walking through life side by side." He had barely looked at it back then, had dismissed it as something small, unimportant. But now, as he stared at it, his vision blurred with unshed tears. This was love. Not control, not power, just love, and he had crushed it beneath his pride. Femi gripped the figurine tightly, holding it to his chest. His throat tightened as emotions swelled inside him. Regret, pain, longing. A single tear rolled down his cheek. "I don't want control. I just want her back." The room was silent, but he didn't stop. "I was wrong. I should have cherished her for who she was. I should have listened, supported her, loved her, not tried to change her." His voice broke. "Abony, if you can hear me, please, come back." The air inside the house suddenly changed. A deep, eerie stillness filled the room. Then, a gust of wind swept through, chilling and strange. The curtains fluttered. The wooden door creaked slightly. The candle on the table flickered wildly before going out. The room grew darker, the only light coming from the soft glow of the street lamps outside. Femi's breath caught. A voice, soft, familiar, fragile. Femi? His heart stopped. His head snapped up, and there, standing in the doorway, was Abony. Her eyes were hazy, distant, as if she had just stepped out of a dream. He had wanted this moment so badly, had prayed for it, but now that it was happening, he was terrified. Would she remember? Would she forgive him? Would she still love him? His lips trembled as he whispered her name, Abony. But before he could say anything more, her eyes focused on him, and what she said next would change everything. Abony. She was really there. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Femi fell to his knees. Tears streamed down his face. He didn't care who saw. He had never cried in front of Abony before. Never allowed himself to be vulnerable. But now, nothing else mattered. Abony. His voice was barely a whisper. I'm so sorry. I was blind. I was foolish. I thought control was love, but I was wrong. So wrong. Abony watched him, her expression unreadable. Love is not about control, Femi. It never was. Femi nodded, his heart aching. I know. I understand now. For the first time in his life, he truly saw her, not just as his wife, not as someone to be managed or tamed, but as a person. A strong, beautiful, intelligent woman who had only ever wanted to walk beside him, not beneath him. He took her hands in his, squeezing them tightly. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I promise, I will never make that mistake again. Abony studied him for a long moment. Then, at last, she smiled. A real, genuine smile. And in that moment, Femi knew he had been given a second chance. The next day, Femi did something no one in the village ever expected. He stood in the bustling marketplace, the same place where he had once spoken with arrogance, where he had once laughed with his friends about how a man should control his home. This time, he stood not as a man demanding respect, but as a man seeking forgiveness. The villagers gathered, whispering among themselves. Mama Ya, his mother, frowned confused. Jide, his best friend, scoffed, muttering, "What is he doing?" Kojo, Abony's brother, crossed his arms, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Then, Femi took a deep breath and spoke. I was wrong. A hush fell over the crowd. I thought being a man meant being in control. I thought love meant obedience. But I was a fool. He turned to Abony, who stood beside him. Abony is not my servant. She is not beneath me. She is my wife, my equal, my partner. And I nearly lost her because of my pride. The villagers murmured, exchanging glances. Some were shocked. Others nodded in quiet approval. Mama Ya opened her mouth to speak, but for once, she had no words. Kojo's hard expression softened, and for the first time, he looked at Femi with something close to respect. Jide scoffed again but said nothing. And Abony? She simply smiled. That night, as the stars twinkled in the dark sky, Femi and Abony sat outside their home, watching the flickering flames of the fire pit. For the first time in a long time, there was peace between them. Abony leaned against him, and this time, Femi didn't take it for granted. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, and then, a shadow moved in the distance. Femi's eyes flickered toward the marketplace. There, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a familiar figure, the old beggar. And though his face was mostly hidden in the shadows, Femi could feel his gaze. For a brief moment their eyes met. Then, slowly, the beggar gave a small nod, an approval, a final lesson learned. And just like that, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. But as he vanished, his voice lingered in the air, carried by the wind. Some men seek power, but only the wise seek love. If you liked the video, then please hit the like button and also subscribe to our channel for more interesting folktales.